Hi, this is Rabbi Jeremy Gordon from New London Synagogue with a big idea for a locked down world. Today, God and science. This, which I suspect is going to come out in mirror reflection for you, is one of the most important books for me on my journey. It's As a Driven Leaf by the conservative Rabbi Milton Steinberg. It tells the story of a figure that we recognize from the Talmud, Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, who becomes a heretic. And the way that Milton Steinberg frames the reason for his heresy is partly to do with a particular story in the Talmud where something awful happens to someone who doesn't deserve it, but more generally because of the way in which Elisha ben Abuya is pursuing science. Elisha ben Abuya in As Driven Leaf is trying to apply Euclid's clarity of scientific approach to the search for ethics, theology, existential meaning. And as that crumbles for him, so does his faith. It's, of course, modelled in part in some of the work of Spinoza so many centuries later. But we have this sense that there is this clash between scientific rigour and religion, between things that can be proved and this is how atheists often articulate it, nonsense fairy stories and the like. But I wonder if the problem is we're focusing on the wrong kinds of science. Let me take a couple of possibilities. The first one has to do with the notion of God. Let me share with you some of the language that Maimonides uses to talk about God in the opening of Yesodei HaTorah in the Mishneh Torah, his greatest halachic and theological work. When Maimonides is writing about God, he says that God, ein lo ketz v'tachlit, has no end, no conceptualization, and no holding. We know in Kabbalistic theology of a way of talking about God as Ein Sof, without any kind of limit. It's a theory about infinity before we really understand mathematically how infinity is actually structured. Let me share again from Maimonides. Maimonides is trying to explain what does it mean when we say that God is one, as of course we say in the Shema. Says Maimonides, and this by the way is writing in 900, something like that. God's oneness isn't like the singularity of one amongst the other integers that exist in the world. Nor is God one as in a category including many integers together, nor one as in a body which can be divided into divisions and distinctions. Rather, God's undivided unity is unlike any other thing in the universe. It really does sound like he's trying to explain infinity. The key thing about infinity from a mathematical perspective is that it's not a number. It's a way of articulating something which is greater than the totality of all numbers. And having started with a fairly basic understanding of infinity, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, the number that comes after all of those numbers, mathematicians then start grouping together all forms of categorization of infinite kinds of numbers. Interestingly, George Cantor, the mathematician, started to use the term Aleph Null as a way of trying to articulate infinities which are collections of entireties of infinite numbers. There's no difference between that kind of language and the kind of language that Maimonides is using, other than the fact that Maimonides uses a one which is not like any other integer. And mathematicians today would use infinity, which is not like any other integer. On this incredibly powerful question as to why bad things happen to good people or doctrines of cause and effect, there's a huge clash in physics between determinists and non-determinists. Determinists, and Einstein was a determinist, thought that you ought to be able to understand exactly why anything could happen if you only had enough data, that you could create a system that would allow you to understand why good things would happen to only good people, or bad things would happen to only bad people, or good things would happen to people you thought were good but turn out to be bad. He thought it could all be plotted. And then along comes the indeterminists, Niels Bohr, the discovery of quantum physics. And it turns out that you can't specify, you can't pin down cause and effect at a micro level. I think that's an incredibly interesting pastoral idea. If 1 million people smoke, a number of those people will get lung cancer. But why does one individual person get lung cancer and another individual person doesn't? Sometimes we're just not going to be able to know precisely what's going on. And that is, I think, the same problem that Moses had when he turns to God and says, Tzadik v'ra, rasha v'tov lo. Why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? Ultimately, science and theology tell us that we cannot determinize everything. We have to acknowledge our inability to capture everything. That's not in any way to be down on what science allows us to understand. Science allows us to understand extraordinary things. And actually, I think to be amazed by the world, you need to love science. You need to understand a little bit about the majesty of this creation in which we live. Science and religion can indeed be at war one to the other, and people can certainly use science in bad faith, and people can certainly use religion with a flagrant disregard of science. But I think that there is a point of meeting, a point where it's possible to test oneself and to challenge oneself and to open up to understandings of things that are at the very, very edges of human capacity to understand, and to believe that there are those things that are beyond all of that, even from a place of scientific rigor. Shabbat Shalom.